Okay, we're going to start reading in chapter 14 of Luke at verse 7. It says there, when Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he'll say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." And Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there's still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" Okay, so the idea of this series, as we read through these various passages in the Gospel of Luke, is that Jesus is reordering our lives so that we live radically unselfish lives. And of course, one of the ways we live radically unselfish lives is through generosity of money. But here today, there's another kind of generosity, a generosity, I'll just use this term, hospitality. Now, before you say to yourself, "Oh, that's a yawner, hospitality," I mean, just give me a chance. It's about parties and hosts and guests. And in fact, here's the way this passage is going to work. A lot of times when Jesus teaches, he gives a teaching, and then there's an application to follow. In fact, this is backward. Jesus gives the application first, and then the teaching that stands behind it comes second. And so I just decided we're going to take in that order as well. We're going to start with the application. Here's how our lives ought to look different. Here's how they ought to change. This is what our lives should look like. And then we'll get to the reason why. So Jesus has things to say to guests, to hosts, and about parties. I mean, all right, let's dig in. First, he has something to say to guests. Now, starting in verse 7, when Jesus gives his application to guests, he just speaks about what I'd consider common sense protocol. In fact, it's almost so common sense that to say it out loud, apparently it's not obvious to everyone, but it should be. Jesus is saying, look, when people come in, if you try to exalt yourself, and in that day, in that culture, when everything would be laid out and there were places to sit, those who would be the highest guests of honor, who had kind of the highest social standing and was closest to the host, they would be honored and sit near the host. And then, depending on the relationships and how it all worked out, you would be seated further and further away, like at wedding receptions. You know how we do, right? Here's the idea. There'd be some people, and they'd be so full of themselves that they'd go and sit in the front. And Jesus says, don't do that. If you do that, when someone more important comes along, the host is going to have to come to you and say, excuse me, I know this is embarrassing, but if you don't mind, there's someone who's more important than you. If you don't mind moving down, and you'll be humiliated. He says, don't do that. He says, instead, just go take the last seat. And then, when the host shows up, he's going to, what are you doing sitting here? You're so much more important to me than this. Why don't you get up and move closer? And then you'll be honored in the sight of everyone. Anyway, that kind of protocol, which I think in some regard is so common sense that it doesn't need to be said aloud, leads to what I think is a profound, I'll even call it a countercultural principle. You find it in verse 11. This is so important. This is what Jesus says. He says, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Man, what I'm going to say, I can't even believe that I have to explain, but it is so against our culture. Our American culture today is exactly the opposite, especially in the era of social media. It is exactly the opposite, that although by the time I'm done, you're going to say, yeah, that's common sense, I'm just going to beg you to pay attention to it. And here's what it is. There is an irony built into life that Jesus taps into and wants to point out. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. Let me see if I can put my finger on it. In order to talk about the irony, I did this, maybe it's going back about 2 months ago. I talked about this in the area of economics. And I think I'll just remind you of what I said there, because I think if you think about it, you'll say, yeah, of course. Here it is. Let's just say that you're a person who wants to get rich. And you go out and you say, you know what I want? I want to get rich. And so what you do is this is your motivation. You say, how am I going to get rich? And you think, okay, well, there's this widget or product or something I can make. And what you do is you go about making these things. Of course, as you go about making them, because your motivation is to get rich, you don't want to spend too much money on the quality. And so the quality might be poor, the thing might not work well, but you're interested in getting rich. And so, of course, as you go to sell it, you're going to put a big price tag on it. And then, look, what you want is to get some dollars. So when it comes to selling it, you don't even mind lying about it to sell it to people like, this is the greatest thing. There's nothing wrong with it at all. I mean, if your motivation starts with, I want to acquire, I want to get, I would submit to you, ironically, to the extent that that's what you want, you will never get it. But if, on the other hand, you have another motivation, and your motivation, your mission, is to help people and serve humanity. And so you think to yourself, man, I've got this great way. In fact, this would be so helpful to people. You come up with a product or a service or a widget that's going to change people's lives and make their life better. And because that's your motivation, you want to give to people and help them. Of course, you want this to be as high a quality as possible. And you want to make it as affordable as possible because you want as many people to have it as possible. And what you do is you just simply let people know, hey, I've got a way to help you. Here's what this does. Now, look, you do not have to have a degree in economics from Yale or Harvard or Princeton. Who is going to make more money? The second person, right? There's an irony built into life. The irony is this: givers gain. To the extent that you are focused on getting, you will never get. To the extent that you're focused on giving almost with no regard to what you'll finally get, ironically, here's what it is: givers are the ones who gain. Now, that's economics. I just point this out because this irony, it's in so many areas of life. How about relationships? Let's just say that when it comes to, look, this is about a party, right? Going to a party, you're a guest at a party. When it comes to society and social relationships, let's say your motivation is that you want to be exalted. You want to be admired. You want to be honored. You want to be recognized. You want to be known. I am somebody. And when I walk into a room, I want everyone to turn their head and look at me because right? If that's your motivation, well, that's one way to go at it. Let's say there's another person and this is their motivation. They want to contribute. They want to build up. They want to give. They want to promote others. They want to accept others. Now, in your experience, in the end, which of these two people get exalted, promoted, known, recognized? Which of the two? It's obvious, right? It's a person who gives, who promotes others. The person who walks in the room and says, everybody look at me. Does anyone want to look at them? No, they don't. This is the irony that Jesus is talking about. Man, it's so obvious, but it's so countercultural. Anyone who exalts themselves will be humbled. Anyone who humbles themselves will be exalted. Here's the irony. To the extent that you're not motivated at all by being exalted and glorified and lifted up, to the extent that you give and promote others and contribute without any regard for what's going to givers gain. That's the principle that Jesus is tapping into. And listen, I know that in the United States right now and our Western culture more broadly, the opposite message is coming across every day as loud as possible. I know that in the era of social media where everyone is encouraging you to take selfies and say, hey, everybody, look at me, and you're encouraged to get attention from everyone, and you want everyone to like your stuff, and you want to be promoted and lifted up. I know that temptation is there to move over to this side, but listen, when you just put it in easy, I can't hardly believe that anyone needs to say this out loud, right? But they do. There is this temptation for us to be a getter, to focus on self. And what Jesus is doing is just a simple application. It's like, stop it. Stop that. Those who give, those who contribute, those who promote others, those who help. And to the extent that they do it without any regard for what they're finally going to get. Look, getters don't gain, givers gain. That's the first lesson, the lesson to the guests at the party. Look, when you show up in a social setting, don't be concerned with yourself and what you're going to get out of it. Be concerned with what you give. We could apply this to our setting this morning. There may be some of us who showed up today and we wondered, what am I going to get out of this service? Don't do it. Show up today and say, what can I give to the people who are around me? What can I give to God? To the extent that you do that, this irony will kick in. Does that make sense? All right, why belabor the point? I can't believe anyone has to say it out loud, but it's so profound, so countercultural. Next, to the hosts. This is what Jesus says. He says, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Let me say something just kind of culturally here first. Culturally, in the society into which Jesus said these words originally, there was a hierarchical and class stratification in that society, such that the entire idea when it came to making friends and inviting people over was that there were people who were above you, who were at the top, and one day you might need access to the top. And so what you'd want to do is you'd want to bring them into your home, you want to provide a meal for them, and sort of put them under obligation so that they owe you back. That's just how society worked. So whenever you always gave with a sense of, what do I get out of it? Because your true motivation wasn't necessarily to just bless someone. It was, one day I may need a door open, and so you made friends to kind of get something for yourself. That's the first comment I want to make. The second comment I want to make has to do with the kind of language that Jesus is using here. He's using idiomatic language. So when Jesus says, listen, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, Jesus isn't literally saying, look, if you become a Christian, from there on out, you say, hey, sorry, mom and dad, you can't come over anymore. I'm a Christian now. That's not the idea. In fact, we use idioms today too, right? Like sometimes we may say, man, I was so mad at John, I could just kill him. Now, if you ever hear someone say that, don't call the police. They don't mean it literally. They mean it idiomatically. And that's what Jesus is saying. In fact, there's a place in the Bible where Jesus said, look, no one can come to me unless they hate their father and their mother and their brother and their sister. Jesus isn't saying, in order to become a Christian, you have to start hating your close relatives. What he's saying is, you have to love me so much. Your devotion to me is so high that in comparison, your greatest loves look like hate. He's not saying literally. Anyway, he's not saying to Christians, hey, from now on, do not invite your friends, your brother, your sister, those close to you. But he's saying something that I think is really important. And it has to do with this. It's about what I'll call radical gospel hospitality. The kind of hospitality that looks to give without any regard for how it will be repaid. It looks to bless without any regard for finally what will come in return. And I really want to press down on this, and here's my reason why. There's a theme that actually runs throughout the Bible that I believe, especially in our culture today, for whatever reasons, is just totally neglected. Here, I want to read a passage. This comes from Acts chapter 2. I just want you to listen. Sometimes I say, hey, turn there. Don't turn there. Just listen. This is a description of the early church and what the early church was like. And I want you to just hear how maybe there's a hospitality at work, something that might be missing today in modern Christian living, okay? Here it is. They, early Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give it to anyone who had a need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Did you hear it? The kind of hospitality that was happening among the early Christians, where they were inviting each other into their homes and they were breaking bread and enjoying fellowship with one another. There's a simple command in Romans chapter 12, verse 13. It's this: practice hospitality. If you're a Christian, I want to challenge you with this. Practice hospitality. The word practice means to work at it. Now, here's the problem when you hear the word hospitality today. There's a way in which I think our modern ears have been tilted towards something that wasn't the original idea. So I think this is what our modern ears hear when we hear practice hospitality. No offense to Martha Stewart, she's probably great. But in our minds, we've added on all kinds of things where the presentation has to be lovely and it has to be, you have to have etiquette and manners. And look, that's not it. The word hospitality, actually the original Greek philoxenia, just means this: the loving of strangers. Now, I'm going to put my attempt at trying to define the type of thing that we're after today as we follow this teaching that we find in the Bible. Here's what I've written: welcome people into your living space, treating strangers as family, and in so doing, build relationships God may use for his kingdom and our good. So let's take a little time with it. Welcome people into your living space. Now, let's talk a little bit about our living space. We'll start with our home. What is our home? Well, I think for most of us, home is the place we go for things like this: rest, harbor, food, refreshment, enjoyment, relationships, family. It's a tough world out there. We're getting beat up. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of troubles. But each night you go home and you can throw your feet up. You can relax. You can be refreshed. It's the place where we eat. We have our appetite satisfied. It's a place where we find a safe harbor among family members and friends. Generally speaking, that's the kind of thing that happens in our home, in our living space. Now, I didn't just say welcome people into your home, because I think actually many of us have, at least in modern society, kind of what I'll call an extended living space. Some of us eat our meals at a particular restaurant where things are the way we like them, the way we want. You might invite people there. The point is this: as you welcome people, you're trying to do these things: help them rest, help them find harbor and peace. You're trying to satisfy their appetites. You're hoping that they'll feel refreshed, that they'll enjoy themselves. You're welcoming them to accomplish these purposes. Second, welcome people. I want to suggest to you three things with regard to people. First, welcome other Christians. Now, you may say to yourself, wait a second, they're not strangers. To which I'd say, I don't know. Look around. You know everybody here? Nobody does, right? Not only are people strangers to you, but there's some people you look at and you go, boy, that person just looks strange. Perfect. That's who to target first. Right? There's a human tendency to just stick with the people we know and the people that are like us. And Jesus, I think, calls us to do something else, to extend ourselves. And a great first place to start is a place like this. In fact, in a larger church like this, there's some advantages and disadvantages to not knowing everyone. Some of us, we maybe grew up in churches where we knew everyone. But in a church like this, there's an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to do what the Bible wants us to do: practice hospitality, treat strangers as friends. Second, our neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. There are people in our everyday life. You see them. Christians do something the rest of the world doesn't do. They extend themselves, they give. And look, when it comes to generosity, don't just narrow it down to what you do with your finances. There's something you can do in everyday life that can have a profound effect on other people. And you don't know, with regard to your neighbors, coworkers, and friends, the kind of way in which God could use that relationship if you would just extend yourself. And then third, needy people. Now, listen, I told you that this is an idiomatic phrase, but I came across this fantastic quote from John Newton. You know, he's the hymn writer of Amazing Grace. I don't know if you know his story, but he was a slave trader who eventually, led the abolitionist movement. He was a Christian pastor. He has this fantastic quote about this passage. I couldn't say any better, so I thought I'd just write it down and read it to you. This is what he said. He would say, "One would think that this passage, Luke 14, 12 through 14, was not considered as a part of God's word. At least I believe there is no one passage so generally neglected by his own people." In other words, John Newton was saying, I don't know why. It's like Christians have cut this out of their Bible because at least this was, back in the 1700s. He's like, by my observation, no one just gathers in the needy and throws a meal for them. He says, "I do not think it unlawful to entertain our friends." So he gets that it's an idiom. But he says this, "But if these words do not teach us that it is in some respect our duty to give a preference to the poor, I am at a loss to understand them." So that's the challenge before us today. You know, there are people who are poor and needy all around us all the time. What if some of us, following the words of Jesus, got so turned on to living unselfish lives that we just threw a banquet to people who could never repay in any way? I think those are the kinds of things that Jesus is saying here. Third, treating strangers as family. Listen, when it comes to Christianity, there's very few people who get argued into faith. There's very few people who get preached into faith. There's lots of people who get loved into faith. You don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to be a profound Bible student. You just have to follow what Jesus says. Practice gospel hospitality. Build relationships. All right, everyone, let's just do this. It's kind of like a little break in the middle of everything we're doing. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to think about the most memorable celebration or meal you ever had. Okay, I really, if you don't mind, close your eyes. How many of you were alone at Taco Bell? Raise your hands. No one. Okay, how many were surrounded, like at a birthday party with family or friends, or at a Thanksgiving meal or a Christmas dinner? Put your hands up now. Okay, almost all hands, right? You can open your eyes. Why? It wasn't about the food. It wasn't about the occasion. What was it about? It's about people and relationships. All of us have this ability to practice radical gospel hospitality and to provide a harbor and a place of refreshment and rest to those around us. Okay, that's the application. Why? Real quickly, let's get into the teaching. Jesus tells this parable. Are you still with me? Starting in verse 15, there's this fellow. He just, in the middle of this banquet, he pipes up. He says, wow, I mean, the people who are going to celebrate in the kingdom of God, the feast that is going to come, they're going to be blessed. And I think Jesus is like, oh, okay, well, you brought it up, so let's talk about who's going to be there. And I actually think, you know, we started with the application, but who are the people who are going to do this? Who are those people? And Jesus tells this parable. He starts out, and I think this is important to understand, that in the culture of the time, whenever you threw a banquet, there are actually two sets of invitations that went out. And here's the reason why: they didn't have refrigeration. And so the food that you would prepare was actually alive at the time of the first invitation. It was a chicken, a goat, a cow. And you'd tell people like, hey, I'm going to throw a party. Would you like to come? And, you know, people would respond. And depending on the number of people who said they would come, you would choose whether you need a chicken, you know, maybe like 3 to 4 people, a goat, you know, 10 to 12 people, or a cow, something far more substantial. And once you received all those invitations, you would go and you'd slaughter the appropriate meat and you'd prepare the appropriate food. And that would take some amount of time. You know, it's not like you go to McDonald's and they just quickly, you know, hand you the food. It would take a lot of time. And so what you do is you'd send someone back out a second time to the people who accepted your invitation and say, okay, come, the feast is ready. And in fact, that's what we read here in verse 17. This is at the time of the banquet. He sent a servant to tell those who'd been invited, come, for everything's now ready. And then here's what happened. One after another disdained the giver of this party by offering lame excuses as to why they weren't going to come. Probably important to know that as Jesus tells this parable, of course, you can't overhear it without realizing this parable is about God and us. God's inviting us. And why a banquet? Why this big, you know, at the end of everything, heaven is often pictured as a banquet, as a big meal. Why? It's the place where all hurts are finally healed, right? You come home. It's a place where all appetites are finally satisfied. God intends to do that. He intends to satisfy all our appetite. It's the place where you finally have rest and peace forevermore. That's the reason why the end of time is always pictured as a big meal, because like all of our longings are finally fulfilled, and there's an invitation. It's out to everyone. Come, and you're invited. Well, anyway, there are people who give these really lame excuses. Who are they? Well, the first one, his lame excuse is this. He says in verse 18, I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me. He's someone who himself is oriented toward getting and acquiring, right? He's acquiring a field. But look, commentaries just skewer this guy, and here's the reason why. In ancient times, you never bought a field without going to look at it. Like, today we have the MLS, you can see the pictures, you got a realtor who can tell you what it's like. Not in those days. In those days, you'd have to go and say, well, where's the water source? Where's the well? Where are the boundary storms? What kind of soil does this have? You're going to see it yourself first before you pay the price. And he's like, look, I've already bought the field. Now I got to go see what I've just purchased. That is El Lamo. The second guy is even worse. Verse 19, he says, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Now, listen, I'm probably like you. I don't know anything about oxen, but here's what I read. Whenever you're buying a pair of oxen, the one thing you're concerned about is, do they pull the yoke at the same speed? I guess when you're plowing with oxen, you want the lines to be straight. And so before you'd ever even think of buying a pair of oxen, you'd want to make sure that when they're yoked up together, there isn't one who's like making them go in circles. And so you always tested the oxen before you bought them. This guy apparently has bought 5 pair without ever trying or testing them. He's like, I bought them, now I got to go see what I got. El Lamo. The last guy is the worst. In fact, you read commentaries about this, everyone's like, man, this guy's just vulgar. I'll do my best to temper that for our setting today. But basically, the commentaries make clear the wedding didn't happen today, because no one in those days would throw a feast on the same day as someone else's wedding. You just didn't do that. It wasn't in good taste. So this person, their excuse is, I've just gotten married, I can't come. They didn't get married today. They got married recently. Now, there are some things you just don't talk about in polite society. And what this guy is basically saying is like, I've got this wife and I'm going to be busy tonight. Please excuse me. Which is just vulgar and rude. You just don't do that. And again, El Lamo. Actually, I think these 3 people are all lame on purpose. There's any number of people who know that at the center of the universe there's a God who wants to heal their hurts, who wants to provide a home, a rest, salvation, forgiveness, an end of misery, a satisfaction of all our appetites. And his arms are wide open. He's like, guys, come, it's grace. You don't have to do anything. I've prepared it. And I don't know why, do you? There are lame people out there who are like, I'm too busy getting some for my own. I don't got time for God. Why? Why? If you're here today, the God of the universe wants to heal your hurts. He wants to satisfy your appetites. His arms are wide open in grace. He's saying, come. What lame excuse do you have? Listen, to show that it's all grace, this is what happens. This giver of the banquet, he is not interested in getting anything in return. He says, look, I just want my banquet to be full. I want there to be a party. I want people's hurts to be healed. I want people to come home. I want them to be refreshed. I want them to experience grace. So he tells the servant, look, go out into the roads, bring people in, bring in the poor, bring in the crippled, bring in the lame. Whoever has a need, bring them in. The servant comes back. He says, okay, there's still room. Then go get some more, he says. Look, if you read very carefully, he doesn't say invite them. In fact, if you look in verse 21, he says specifically, go out into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring them in. And then in verse 23, he says, go out into the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in. Why doesn't he say invite them? He doesn't say invite them because in that culture, you wouldn't have believed it. You don't receive an invitation unless something's expected in return. And here's someone who's saying, no, just come. You don't have to do anything. Just come. My arms are wide open. I just want to heal your hurts. I just want to provide refreshment to you. And they're thinking, well, I don't have anything to give back. And the reason you have to compel them, bring them in, is that if you don't insist, they just think it's too good of news. Maybe some of you who are here today, you're saying, can God really forgive me? Does he really want to heal my hurts? Does he really want to refresh me? Is he really going to forgive me? I don't believe it. It's just too good. It's just too good, and I get it. I get it. The main story of Scripture is that even though we more or less had every lame excuse telling God we could care less about you, he sent his Son, whose arms on the cross were wide open, who came to pay the price of our debt, who came to take the punishment for our sin. And the Bible says that it's by his amazing grace that we're brought in. We don't have to do anything. And you're like, we don't have to do anything? No, you don't have to do it. Just come. That's too good of news. I don't care. Just come. And look, let me press down on it because I think I have to compel some of you today. What is your excuse? Just come. Just come. Now, here's the kicker. That's the teaching. Some of us will catch a picture of that. We'll say, that's the God at the center of the universe? That's unbelievable. Yes, it is. I'm one of his people? Yes, you are. Well, I want to live like that? Good. Stop working at being a getter. Stop working at trying to exalt yourself. Become a giver. There is an irony built into the universe, whether you're the guest at the party or the host. When you get into a social setting, you're not saying to yourself, what's in it for me? You're saying, how can I bless others? Because at the center of the universe, there's a God who gives without any regard for getting. There's a God of grace who calls us to be people of grace. And so I just want to conclude today in a way where the teaching sinks in. If that's who God is, and you're a Christian, now just ask yourself one simple question: who am I supposed to be? Let's pray.